35 savage blows to her face and head. Blood soaked the floral-printed pillow beneath her. Marilyn Sheppard, just 31 years old and 4 months pregnant, lay brutally murdered in her own bed, while her 7-year-old son slept peacefully in the next room. Her husband, a respected neurosurgeon, claimed a bushy-haired intruder was responsible. But was this a case of a desperate cover-up by a murderous spouse? Or had the American justice system condemned an innocent man? This is the story that would inspire The Fugitive and change the face of American criminal justice forever. Welcome, true crime enthusiasts, to one of the most controversial murder cases of the 20th century. A case that would expose the dangerous intersection of media sensationalism and criminal justice, forever changing how Americans view the presumption of innocence. The story begins in Bay Village, Ohio, an affluent suburb of Cleveland, where successful people lived in beautiful homes along the shores of Lake Erie. Among them was the Sheppard family. Dr. Sam Sheppard, a prominent 30-year-old neurosurgeon, his wife Marilyn, and their young son Sam Jr., nicknamed Chip. They lived at 28924 Lake Road, in a 2-story home that offered spectacular views of the lake. To their neighbors and friends, they appeared to be living the American dream. The evening of July 3, 1954, started normally enough. The Sheppards had invited their neighbors, Don and Nancy Ahern, over for dinner. The couples enjoyed cocktails on the porch, taking in the summer breeze off Lake Erie. They had a pleasant dinner, after which they settled in to watch the film Strange Holiday. As the evening wound down, Sam fell asleep on a daybed in the living room while wearing his corduroys, a white t-shirt, and loafers. Marilyn saw their guests out, and everyone assumed it would be just another peaceful night in Bay Village. No one could have predicted the horror that would unfold in the early hours of Independence Day, 1954. According to Sam Sheppard's account, he was jolted awake by his wife's screams around 3:30 a.m. He rushed up the stairs to their bedroom, where he encountered what he described as a bushy-haired form standing over Marilyn's bed. As he entered the room, this mysterious figure seemingly turned and struck him from behind. A struggle ensued, ending with Sheppard being knocked unconscious. When he regained consciousness, Sam checked on Marilyn, but it was far too late. The scene was horrific. Marilyn's pajama top had been pushed up, exposing her torso, though there were no signs of sexual assault. Her face was virtually unrecognizable, having been beaten with such savage force that her teeth were broken and her skull had multiple fractures. The autopsy would later reveal the brutal extent of the attack. 35 separate blows, mostly concentrated on her head and face. The horror wasn't over. Sam claimed that upon regaining consciousness again, he saw the intruder downstairs and chased him out of the house. They struggled on the beach by Lake Erie, where Sheppard was knocked unconscious once more. He awoke partially submerged in the cold lake water, his collarbone injured from the fight. At 5:40 a.m., Sam made a crucial phone call to his neighbor, Spencer Houck, who happened to be the mayor of Bay Village. His words would later be scrutinized by investigators. "I think they've killed Marilyn." The use of the plural, they raised immediate red flags with law enforcement. The crime scene presented investigators with numerous puzzling elements. While there were obvious signs of violence in the bedroom, the rest of the house was remarkably undisturbed. No signs of forced entry were found. Though Sheppard claimed it was a burglary, the only items missing were his watch, keychain, and ring, all of which would later be discovered in a green bag in the bushes near the house. The handling of the crime scene would later become a source of major controversy. The house was left completely unsecured, with journalists, neighbors, and various officials freely walking through the property. Critical evidence was moved, contaminated, or lost entirely. These investigative mistakes would have far-reaching consequences for the case. Young Chip remarkably had slept through the entire ordeal in the adjacent bedroom. This detail would later spark heated debate. How could a child sleep through such violence mere feet away? But perhaps even more damaging to Sam Sheppard's claims of innocence was his own behavior in the aftermath of the murder. He never checked on his son during or after the attack. When questioned, his answers seemed vague and inconsistent to investigators. Then came the revelation that would turn public opinion sharply against him. Despite initially denying any extramarital affairs, Sheppard was forced to admit to a relationship with Susan Hayes, a laboratory technician from his hospital. The affair had lasted several months, and though it had ended before the murder, this disclosure painted Sheppard in a new light. Was this respected doctor actually a philanderer who had murdered his pregnant wife? The initial investigation was plagued by irregularities. Sam wasn't formally questioned until July 5, and even then, detectives had to interview him in his hospital room where he was being treated for his injuries from the alleged struggle. His family, particularly his brothers who were also doctors, seemed to be protecting him from a thorough police investigation. This appearance of special treatment would soon spark a media frenzy that would change the course of the case forever. The media's role in the Sheppard case would prove unprecedented and ultimately devastating. The Cleveland Press, led by editor Louis Seltzer, began a relentless campaign against Sam Sheppard. Their front-page editorials carried sensational headlines like, "Why isn't Sam Sheppard in jail?" and "Somebody is getting away with murder." If you're finding this deep dive into one of America's most controversial cases fascinating, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss our upcoming revelations about this shocking case. This media pressure had an immediate effect. On July 30, 1954, Sam Sheppard was arrested in his father's home and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest itself was theatrical. Police arrived at 10 p.m., handcuffing the doctor in front of reporters who had been tipped off beforehand. The trial began on October 18, 1954, and would prove to be one of the most sensational in American legal history. The small courtroom was packed with reporters, with some estimates suggesting over 70 journalists were present each day. The judge, Edward Blythin, seemed to encourage the circus-like atmosphere, even providing special tables for the press directly in front of the jury box. The prosecution, led by John J. Mahone, painted a compelling picture. They argued that Sam Sheppard had grown tired of his married life and wanted to be with Susan Hayes. The murder, they claimed, occurred after an argument about his infidelity. They pointed to several suspicious elements: the lack of forced entry into the home, the selective nature of the supposed burglary. Only Sam's personal items were taken, and they were found nearly intact nearby. The fact that Sam's T-shirt, which he had been wearing earlier that night, was found neatly folded on the dock, despite his claim of multiple violent struggles. Most damning was the blood evidence. Small drops of blood were found throughout the house in a pattern that suggested someone had walked around after the murder. The defense team, led by William Corrigan, fought back vigorously. They emphasized Sam's injuries, which included a swollen eye, bruised face, and injured neck. They brought in witnesses who testified about seeing a bushy-haired man in the vicinity that night. They argued that the blood pattern could have been left by first responders who contaminated the crime scene. But perhaps their biggest challenge was overcoming the prejudice created by the media coverage. Jurors, despite claims they hadn't been influenced, had been exposed to months of negative press about Sheppard. The Cleveland Press alone had published over 399 articles about the case, most portraying Sheppard as guilty. The trial revealed fascinating forensic details. The murder weapon, never found, was believed to be a rod-like instrument, possibly a fireplace tool. The killer had likely been spattered with blood, yet no bloody clothing was ever found. The crime scene showed signs of staging. Drawers pulled out, but their contents undisturbed, suggesting someone trying to make it look like a burglary. Dr. Samuel Gerber, the coroner, testified that the murder weapon left distinctive marks that matched a surgical instrument. This testimony would later be thoroughly discredited, but at the time it seemed to implicate Sheppard directly. The prosecution focused heavily on Sheppard's affair with Susan Hayes. When Hayes took the stand, she testified about their relationship in detail, describing gifts he'd given her and their intimate encounters. This testimony devastated Sheppard's image as a devoted husband and father. One of the most compelling prosecution arguments centered on Chip's undisturbed sleep during the murder. How could a 7-year-old boy sleep through such violence mere feet away? The prosecution suggested this indicated the killer knew the house's layout and deliberately kept quiet while moving between rooms. The defense brought forward multiple witnesses who had seen suspicious individuals near the Sheppard home that night. 2 teenagers testified about seeing a stranger on the road near the house. A fishing boat captain reported seeing mysterious lights on the beach. But none of these leads were thoroughly investigated by police, who had focused exclusively on Sheppard from the beginning. After 9 weeks of testimony, numerous witnesses, and intense media coverage, The case went to the jury on December 17, 1954. They deliberated for 4 days, during which time they were sequestered at the Carter Hotel. On December 21, after 101 hours of deliberation, they returned their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Sam Sheppard's reaction was one of complete shock. He stood motionless as Judge Blythin sentenced him to life in prison. His family, particularly his mother, was devastated. She would die by suicide less than 2 weeks after the verdict, followed shortly by Sam's father, who died of a bleeding gastric ulcer. But this was far from the end of the Sheppard case. The next decade would see a series of appeals, a landmark Supreme Court decision, and a second trial that would change the face of American criminal justice forever. The conviction of Dr. Sam Sheppard marked only the beginning of a legal odyssey that would span decades and fundamentally change American jurisprudence. While Sheppard began serving his life sentence at the Ohio State Penitentiary, his legal team worked tirelessly on appeals. During his imprisonment, Sheppard's life took dramatic turns. He earned the nickname Doc among inmates and even saved several lives using his medical skills in the prison hospital. Yet the toll of incarceration was evident. His once successful medical practice was gone. His parents had died tragically, and his son Chip was being raised by relatives. Enter F. Lee Bailey, a young, ambitious lawyer who would later become one of America's most famous attorneys. In 1961, Bailey took over Sheppard's appeals, convinced of his innocence. Bailey's fresh approach would prove revolutionary. Instead of focusing solely on trial errors, he attacked the media circus that had surrounded the original trial. Bailey's research uncovered disturbing details about the 1954 trial. Judge Edward Blythin had told a reporter before the trial began, "Well, he's guilty as hell. There's no question about it." This statement alone demonstrated the extraordinary prejudice Sheppard had faced. The jury hadn't been sequestered during the trial's first 9 weeks, exposing them to endless negative publicity. In 1964, Bailey achieved a breakthrough. Federal Judge Carl Weinman ruled that Sheppard had been denied his right to a fair trial, stating the original trial had been a mockery of justice. However, the state of Ohio appealed this decision, sending the case to the United States Supreme Court. On June 6, 1966, in what would become a landmark decision, the Supreme Court ruled in Sheppard's favor. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that the carnival atmosphere of the first trial had violated Sheppard's right to due process. The court's decision in Sheppard v. Maxwell would set new standards for fair trials and media coverage of criminal proceedings, standards that persist to this day. After nearly 10 years in prison, Sam Sheppard was granted a new trial. The second trial, beginning in October 1966, was dramatically different from the first. Bailey's defense strategy was aggressive and innovative. He challenged the prosecution's timeline, presented new evidence about blood patterns, and thoroughly discredited Dr. Gerber's testimony about the murder weapon. Perhaps most significantly, Bailey emphasized what the first trial had overlooked: blood evidence suggesting the killer was left-handed. Sam Sheppard was right-handed. Bailey also highlighted the trail of blood leading from the murder room to the basement, drops that contained typo blood which matched neither Sam nor Marilyn. The new jury took just 12 hours to reach their verdict: not guilty. On November 16, 1966, after serving nearly 10 years in prison, Sam Sheppard was finally free. But freedom would not bring him the peace he sought. The years following his acquittal were troubled. Sheppard struggled to rebuild his medical career, facing skepticism and suspicion despite his acquittal. He briefly attempted a career as a professional wrestler under the name Killer Sheppard, a decision that damaged his credibility. He married twice more, first to Ariane Tebben-Johans in 1964, they divorced in 1969, and then to Colleen Strickland in 1969. Tragically, Sam Sheppard died on April 6, 1970, at the age of 46, from what his son Chip described as liver failure due to alcohol abuse. The years of imprisonment, stress, and public scrutiny had taken their devastating toll. But the story doesn't end there. In the 1990s, advances in DNA testing brought new attention to the case. Sam and Marilyn's son, Sam Reese Sheppard, Chip, worked with attorney Terry Gilbert to pursue civil litigation against the state of Ohio, seeking to declare his father innocent and receive compensation for wrongful imprisonment. During this process, DNA testing was performed on preserved evidence from the crime scene. The results were intriguing. bloodstains found at the scene didn't match Sam or Marilyn Sheppard. Instead, they suggested the presence of a third person. This led investigators to a new suspect, Richard Eberling, who had been the Sheppard's window washer in 1954. Eberling was already imprisoned for another murder when he became a suspect in Marilyn's death. He had a history of violence against women and had been caught with one of Marilyn's rings in 1959. Perhaps most significantly, he was left-handed. In 2000, Sam Reese Sheppard's civil case went to trial. Despite the new evidence, the jury ruled against him, finding that he had failed to prove his father's innocence by a preponderance of evidence. This verdict didn't declare Sam Sheppard guilty, but it did deny his estate any compensation for his imprisonment. The case remains officially unsolved to this day. Richard Eberling died in prison in 1998, taking any secrets he might have had to his grave. Sam Reese Sheppard passed away in 2020, having spent much of his life trying to clear his father's name. The Sheppard case left an indelible mark on American society. It inspired the Fugitive TV series and subsequent film, changed how courts handle pretrial publicity, and remains a cautionary tale about the intersection of media influence and criminal justice. The house at 28924 Lake Road still stands, though its appearance has been significantly altered. For many, it serves as a silent reminder of one of America's most controversial murder cases. The fundamental question remains unanswered. Who killed Marilyn Reese Sheppard? Was it her husband Sam, who maintained his innocence until his death? Was it Richard Eberling, the window washer with a violent past? Or was it someone else entirely, whose identity remains unknown? Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this case is that somewhere, someone knows the truth. But after nearly 7 decades, that truth seems destined to remain one of America's most enduring mysteries. Before we end this journey into one of America's most infamous cold cases, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these fascinating true crime stories to light. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.